Hey everyone, welcome to this week's community call on October 17th, all around replication studies. It's going to be a little bit shorter of a call as the Future of Science seminar ran long today, but it was a wonderful conversation with Professor Gideon Nave, which can be found on the DeSci Foundation's website, All Around Replication. Today's call is about replication markets and how validation and curation services can play into the business models of scientific societies. So I'm sure we'll be kind of pulling off of some of what Professor Nave said in this call today. A couple quick updates. We'd like to welcome Eliana DeSoto as the newest moderator of the DeSci Labs product community. Welcome, Ellie. Thank you for joining, and we're excited to have you.
Yay!
Yay, hey Ellie, welcome.
All right. We're going to be kicking off the Node Stewards program this upcoming, I guess that's tomorrow, actually. John and Carla
tomorrow at
are
1.
going to be kicking that off. So we've had two different interest calls. For anyone who wants to learn more, please feel free to reach out to John or Carla or just generally post in the Discord. We're excited to be highlighting the power of open science through open state repositories and what Web3 can do with respect to the back end of science. Couple other topics. There are quite a few different conferences coming up. DeSci Labs will be in Lisbon, where I think Carla is going to be giving a talk that maybe she can speak to a little bit more in just a second. And then I think that's actually IPFS camp and funding the Commons, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of stuff happening there. And it's been fantastic. We can quickly, if anyone wants to talk about any of those topics, we can. Or if not, we can jump straight into the topic of the call for today, which is validation and curation services as business models for scientific societies. And hearing nothing, I say we go ahead and jump straight on in. Chris, do you want to get us kicked off?
So where should we start? There's so much to say.
Well, maybe a quick overview of the Future of Science seminar for anyone who wasn't able to attend.
Yeah, so we have Carla here. So I think Carla will be great to give us a little overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, we just had Gideon on, who told us about, basically he told us a story about how there was this research on how oxytocin supposedly increases trust in humans. And it was a super small sample, but it was published in Nature, I think in 2005. And then from there, so much research spun out of that with like a host of other very small sample studies that did other research related to oxytocin and social interaction. And then like just 10 years later, it turns out somebody actually started reviewing all of this body of research and found out, hey, wait, actually all of these studies are not really finding any significant effects, and maybe we should stop wasting our efforts and resources into pursuing more oxytocin research. Or maybe first we need to do a really good replication study that actually tells us, is there something here, and should we be putting that much resources and efforts into this direction of research? And that was the topic of the seminar. And afterwards we got kicked off in a discussion about how we can incentivize or change the incentives that we currently have about scientific publishing and also scientific careers and how you advance in your career from publishing small and novel studies to publishing large, joint, rigorous studies that actually find true effects or check whether there are true effects. That's what the seminar was about. We're going to publish the recording in just a bit, hopefully tomorrow. There's going to be a podcast episode following this discussion as well, which should be very interesting. I'll keep you up to date with those as well. And for anybody who wants to join in on the discussion that's going to follow this seminar, I'm going to put in the chat an invite to our Slack channel. So feel free to join that one as well. It's an ongoing offline discussion that we have there.
Yeah, and I think broadly speaking, the goal of the seminar is really to invite people who have been thinking a lot about meta science or the science of science, and essentially provide us with ideas and to improve the state of affairs, right? So that we manage, as a community to build an accurate mental map, right, of how to tackle this problem and where the issues are. And this is a very broad topic, right? It goes from matters related to scientific culture, to matters related to technology, the infrastructure on which the scientific record is built, to matters related to incentive alignment between stakeholders, down to business models of publishers and incentives of funders. So there's a lot of, science, the scientific engine today is a great emergent system, right? That's a product of multiple moving parts that have reached some sort of equilibrium over time. And it'll be very interesting to have these world-renowned experts to give us guidance and to give us, their ideas on how to improve things. And we'll be touching on three big topics. One of them is matters related to scientific validation, reproducibility, replicability, everything that has to do with the robustness of the scientific record. And I think the underlying question here is like, how do we make a more robust scientific record, a more reproducible scientific record, a more replicable scientific record? And this touches a lot, both with incentives, but also technology. Another big topic is all about funding. It's, what are the incentives today around funding? What are alternative models of funding that could be more efficient, that could fund, more daring research or research that ends up being more robust and more reproducible, understanding different alternative models for funding. And there's lots of really interesting ideas floating around right now that are being experimented with. We see, quadratic funding with Gitcoin. We see things like impact certificates and impact market and hypercerts with Protocol Lab. So there's a lot of these really interesting experiments that we want to talk about. There's also this idea of funding people, not projects, with new science and these great folks over there. So it'll be really good to have, to hear about their perspective and understand what are the different models, the alternative models out there, and how could they best, be best implemented and utilized. Finally, the third topic is the role of so we've seen that the landscape of AI is accelerating dramatically, and we start having things like paper mills in China that are producing papers with GPT-3. Essentially, fake papers that are there to essentially boost your publication record. On the other hand, there's so this is a nefarious application of AI. There's also applications such as automatically detecting fraud and image manipulation in published research, which would be a very powerful and compelling case study for an application of AI. And these applications will keep building up, right? You could think of mundane yet very important things, like, for example, how to automatically generate metadata so that science is actually findable and reusable. But then there's more ambitious things like, hey, could we actually, use these technologies to synthesize the literature? Could we use these technologies to extract information in a way that allows humans to aggregate this information in a more effective way? And these are people, for example, the people over at elicit.org are working on things like that, right? Alternative ways to query the scientific records, a brilliant application of AI. So yeah, the third topic will be understanding everything that has to do from the practical implications to the moral implications of employing AI for the furtherance and the betterment of science.
So I'm curious. We were talking before we kicked off the call. Like, this last talk was about replication and that crisis, and the whole story about how one foundational discovery led to so much waste in the system. In this future system with this new technology, like, what's the first step? What would a system look like where that study, which has value, but where that study was published and then replicated almost immediately 1,000 times just to make sure that its claims are accurate?
Well, the ideal system that fixes this essentially produces a great incentive at the time of publication, right? So let's say you have a speculative study with a rather small sample size that makes one of those big if true claims, right? It's like, if this is true, this can change everything. Now, the first reflex of such a system should be, okay, can I identify this? And then can I produce incentives that are strong and compelling enough so that I can orient the attention of the scientific community towards producing a replication, high quality replication of that work, right? So I think that's really the way, and this goes this utilizes methods such as pre-registered reports, these peer-reviewed and pre-registered analysis plans, which essentially constitute the gold standard of how we should be conducting these replication efforts. So yeah, that would be essentially the cornerstone of a system, is that it should be capable of identifying the studies that are big if true, and B, deploying incentives that are sufficiently strong to reorient the priorities and the attention of the scientific community. Now, of course, point B is where the devil lies in the detail. And of course, that's something you can accomplish with money, but it's not very cost effective. But it's something you can definitely accomplish with that. Journals that have essentially a monopoly on prestige, they can do this far more easily, right? I mean, if Nature said, well, here, we will automatically publish you if you create a high quality scientific replication, could get much more bang for their buck, so to speak. So yeah, these are the really core factors, right? First is identification, and the second one is incentivization, and after that is of course the entire workflow and procedures that need to be in place to ensure that the replication itself is convincing and is high quality, right? So for that we need validations systems. You need to be able to query the opinions of experts. You need to be able to elicit sample sizes that are convincing. You need to be you need a lot. There's a lot of moving parts down there, but it's this is not something that's never been done, right? So there's a lot of journals now that essentially offer acceptance of manuscript based on pre-registered reports and analysis plan, which is a wonderful thing. So it's not that the scientific community has never done that. It's more about how can you create a system that orchestrates these things and that manages to essentially create sufficient level of community participation so that we can identify and detect these studies in the first step, and in the second step, create sufficient incentives. And creating sufficient incentives, ideally, would be a mixture of both explicit incentives but also implicit incentives. So we would need ways to create positive externalities for the people that participate in these studies, such that they can accrue recognition, and that they need to be able to be visible to their funders. So that's those are really the two crucial components.
Interesting. I wonder how much of it is about just like culture too, like making replication sexy. It's not like the person who proposes a law that's important. It's the person who seconds it. It's the person who says, yes, this is right, or hey, let's keep looking at this. And by getting that publication, it's almost like seen by the community as more valuable than the original claim, which I could make a claim right now. Why not?
And I think there's a strong case to be that replication should be the things that are considered most sexy and fashionable as a matter of social consensus. The reason is they're a lot of work and they're actually less engaging to produce as a scientist. And the reason for that is that a lot of scientists are looking for new things, right? Things that have never been discovered. So merely reproducing or replicating something that has already been done out there isn't the same level of engaging discovery, right? So there's almost like a natural intrinsic disincentive to pursue replications, right? You could say, quote unquote, they're more boring to do, right? Which is of course a terrible thing to say, and it's true.
It's true,
right? It's true.
Yeah,
So
you're not going to change that. So how do you get people to?
That's the thing, right? That's why you need to create, you need to have strong incentives to do it. You need to be essentially hailed as a hero by your community, right? We need to praise people that do this. We need to give them funding to conduct the studies that they want.
So it's not just get the PhD candidates to get their PhD by replicating a bunch of stuff?
I mean, honestly, that's a great PhD to have, because at the end of the day, you learn so much doing that. And the thing is, conducting a high quality replication is often way beyond the scope of a single PhD student, right? Because
Really?
you need to have much larger sample sizes if you want to do it correctly. You need to be deeply, deeply into the weeds and the norms of that scientific community. You need to have, extremely high level expert guidance. Very often, there are consortiums or many labs, multiple laboratories that come together. These things are difficult to orchestrate, right? And they're also heroic lifts. So I think, we almost need to have like some sort of community consensus around what is scientific virtue, right? And you would factor in, as part of a virtuous act of being a scientist is, spending 2 years of your life conducting a high quality replication to improve the health of the scientific record. That is virtuous. We should recognize that. Those are these
Yeah.
incentives, essentially.
And it comes back to what Eric prompted the call today with like the scientific societies, with the arcs, as Nodes describes them, is there could be a scientific society comprised of a lot of really high level researchers who are doing novel or research into novel discoveries, but they give out accolades to people as an arc. They are an arc, let's say, and they give out accolades to people who do replication. And getting that accolade, getting that badge means that you have access to other things. Maybe it's a conference, maybe it helps on your resume. It gives you access to funders like it. And that's maybe a way to incentivize using a way to use a scientific society in this sort of blockchain world to incentivize replication and reproducibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it should be a mark of scientific virtue, essentially. It should be a mark of doing the right thing, and it should be recognized by such, not just funders, not just hiring committees, but everyone, really. So it's and especially, if you have skin in the game and you publish a result, and then 5 years later you publish a high quality replication that actually invalidates your first study, well, that is perhaps,
You should be a god.
yeah, yeah, like this is fantastic, right? It's like we shouldn't criticize people. Like, I think there's a couple of things that need to be navigated really, really delicately here, right? Like, there's a natural rate of non-replication. If you do everything right, still a natural rate of non-replication. It's actually quite high. Depends, of course, on the statistical power. And you don't want to like condemn people for doing irreproducible studies if they've done everything the best they can. What you want is like, you want to praise people for changing their minds in light of new evidence, right? Where they have skin in the game, and you want to even praise them even more if they conduct high-powered replication of previous work that they have themselves done, that they have grown to be uncertain of, right? So that's the case. That's why we have the Zach versus Paul Fair dichotomy, right? Paul Zach, having, not changing his mind because of all his own personal and financial and ego interests, right? Whereas Ernst Fair does change his mind and does do the right thing. Same story with the Power Pause, right? And these two, and Dinah versus the Power Pause first author, right? So, and I think here there's this implicit thing where we recognize virtue, but it needs to be, somehow made more explicit in a way, right? We need attestations, we need markers of these things. We need to create more transparencies around that, and ultimately we need, this is then like the technological level, right? You should have, if you find that study, oxytocin increases trust in humans, well, you should have the link to the replication, the high-powered replication, which is conspicuously connected to it. And that should be, every article on Google Scholar should have a little tag, or essentially another category that says, look for replications, right? There's citations, but there's also replications. And you click there and you see the replications. And maybe you have like an integration with elicit.org that tells you, what is the outcome of that replication, positive or negative? How convincing is that replication? Very convincing, not really convincing. So that would be like, what the scientific record of tomorrow would look like. Essentially a place that is highly interconnected, that allows people to find the relevant information to hold accurate beliefs about the state of knowledge, which we don't have today. And it's
which is
absolutely,
crazy.
yeah, it's terrible.
Oh man! So also like you could have, like, just go back to the societies thing. You could have different societies that just build up reputations as knowing who's done something virtuous or not, which is silly, but and it's very dangerous if it's in a centralized system. Like if the government is giving you a trust score and they're the only one who can give you a trust score, pretty dangerous. But if you have a decentralized system where anyone can form a society that distributes trust badges, so to speak, then that society builds its own reputation based on who they determine is trustworthy, then you have a very free and open system where other participants outside of these societies can look at something and say, oh, trustworthy, not trustworthy, and see exactly who has said it is trustworthy or not. And an example of this in the way research is done could be like patient groups. So if there's a huge grandiose claim about like diabetes and a way to cure or treat diabetes, a diabetes patient group might have an interest in ensuring that that is an accurate claim, so they can crowdsource and raise funds to replicate the study, and that's can be done across all fields. I see biomedical like being very relevant, but there are a bunch of space enthusiasts who want to make sure it's actually ET when we say we found aliens or something like that. So there's a lot of power behind funding that ties funding and scientific societies and replication together. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is identifying what is big if true.
Yeah,
That's the first
definitely.
step. And the second step is creating enough explicit incentives so that it creates a movement of people that work towards that goal.
And do you really think AI can determine what's big if true?
No, I don't think so. I think not at this stage. But then again, it's a field that moves so fast. No, but it can do many other things that are very valuable right now. So you can essentially extract really valuable information from these articles. You can do a lot of interesting new types of literature searches. There's really some interesting applications that are appearing right now. No, I think the big if true part is something that will remain uniquely human for a long time.
And it's difficult because something might, like when it's published, might not seem big if true, but then like 15 years later, someone stumbles on it, it's like, oh, this is big if true.
Yeah, although these things tend to be quite, to be rare. Usually, the big if true things, are identified by either venues or journals, and it's not that common that you have that specific case you've described here. It does happen, but yeah, we have to remember that there's scientific editor like incentive scientists have the incentive to submit to the best, highest ranked possible journal that they think their work can make it in. And in the second stage, it's the editor of the scientific journal who essentially is this prediction machine, right? The editor is there to answer this precise question, right? Is it big if true, or is it not big if true, right? Because they have no interest, like a general interest, broad audience, high impact scientific publisher has no interest in small if true, right? None at all. It really is about big if true, and it's about how likely is it for this new piece of knowledge to generate interest from the scientific community, and over the years generate a lot of citations, because that ultimately links back to the impact factor, which is the KPI of these scientific journals. And so they're judged by that, right? Every year they get the update on their impact factor. It goes up or down, and that's the race. So scientific edit and impact factor is essentially a measure of the success of whether or not you're capable of identifying big if true. Now, the if true part is the one that is, the most contentious, because very often the bigger the claim, the more surprising the results, the lower the probability that they're true. And this has to do with Bayes' theorem. And the more unintuitive something is, the greater the evidence it requires to be made convincing. That's why we say, that, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And, extraordinary claims shouldn't be ruled based on P005 with 40 university students. That's not convincing on a Bayesian level. On the other hand, having tremendously large sample sizes, multiple ways of testing something, ruling out multiple confounding factors, and essentially engaging in that high quality programmatic, high powered analysis is what you'd want to confirm if something's big if true. But then, of course, there's a question. It's like, well, doing that takes a long time. Should we publish, perhaps preliminary results that are big if true, and then just accept that the probability of them being true is actually not that high, and just live with that, and issue a call for replication at the same time, just following the publication of that, big if true idea, and having that call of replication essentially adjudicate over that original claim. That could be a way of essentially accelerating the dissemination of knowledge and the dissemination of big if true claim. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of ways to explore those problems, I think, and be really interesting to see which systems in the end manage to really push the story here.
Yeah, that last comment you made me remember something that Carla brought up during the seminar about the incentive of researchers to work in private, so to speak, and not publish until the end of the paper. And if you have a way to claim, and this has nothing to do with replication from the beginning, but I think it's very tied. But if you have a way to claim credit for a micropublication or a publication as you go, you can submit your data set before you've really moved on to the next, and that can be replicated before you do the rest of the paper. If that it can't be replicated, then you don't need to waste all the time going through this big thing that's not going to be true anyway, because you can't even get that first step done. So there's value here in just having an open, immutable ledger that can timestamp and cryptographically secure credit. There's so much intersectionality in all of these mechanisms and structures. It's crazy.
Yeah, micropublications are really interesting, although there's a case to be made that, the smallest possible micropublication, different versions of that, but one case would be just a claim or hypothesis, right? A leads to B. Some sort of causal assertions about two states of the world being interdependent. Well, if that becomes a creditable unit of knowledge, then there's also an incentive to programmatically generate all possible combinations of states of the world. And you end up with actually no new knowledge because, some author has generated 1 billion causal claims on two interlinked states of the world, right? Because there's very little cost in doing that. Whereas, writing an article, writing a preprint, these things take a tremendous time to make a convincing case. So if there is like an incentive to essentially saturate the graph with claims, causal claims, or essentially these minimal units of micropublication, then we need to come up with ways to essentially prevent spam, or to essentially, it gets really tricky, right? Like micropublications get tricky in terms of degenerate behavior that can happen in these types of games, right? So like the type of behaviors you don't expect at the get-go, but they lead to bad equilibriums down the road.
Did Bitcoin not solve this with microtransactions and a sliding scale based on use? So like if I generate 1 billion different, think of a micropublication as just simply a transaction on the blockchain. If I produce 1 billion transactions, that 1,000,000th transaction is going to be very, very expensive, and it's going to be prohibitively expensive. So I'm not going to be able to do that. In fact, probably after like the 15th transaction, I might find it to be too expensive for my taste. And you can do the same thing.
That's not, let's say, exclusive to Bitcoin. You could say any system that introduces costs, right, prevents spam, and that's broadly true. Depending on the cost, and yes, definitely. I mean, that's a way to guard against essentially, this low value, high noise to signal saturation of micro publications that people could do. No, I definitely agree with that. There's all sorts of interesting mechanism designs around that, but it is, micro publications of this style is really a seismic shift, right, in the scientific culture. I'm really interested in these micro publications myself. Generally, I'm just a little bit cautious that there's essentially a level of scientific praxis which is extremely ingrained in for a variety of reasons. I think scientists in general, they scholars in general want to produce books. I think that's a little bit the thing. They want to produce physical artifacts like of knowledge that stand the test of time, and that essentially take physical form, and that would have a part in a library of some sort, a great library. And so we're attached to that format of creation and recording knowledge, right? We're attached to that idea that I get to tell my story of how I discovered that new knowledge, and I get to make a convincing case that will survive the bombardment of criticism of my peers, right? And will come out of it reinforced and create durable new knowledge for people to build upon. And so there's almost a deeply ingrained Lindy factor, right, about what it is to be a scholar, which is not aligned with this idea of micropublications. Now, that being said, we've seen with systems like Twitter, right, that humans do have a blast, and they do appreciate, creating short-lived conversations with others. And you could imagine, well, micro publications are perhaps, conversations on science, and perhaps science is, just a series of conversations, and that's the perspective that, a number of people would take. It's a very interesting perspective, and therefore, you're essentially just creating having conversations is Lindy in itself. And if you could create a system of micro publications that incentivize high value conversations between scholars, that could provide tremendous value down the road. And I'm really excited to see these types of experiments. And I think there's for example, Joel and a few others are working on these discourse graph, right, where there's different types, there's different types of assertions you can make, and you can link them together, and you can add evidence, and you can add contra evidence, and you can essentially form conversations around ideas to ultimately unearth the truth about things. I think that's really interesting, and I really look forward to the results of these experiments, and I'd love to be able to, I think also support these types of efforts in the systems we're building. Every path needs to be tried out, essentially.
Yeah, the scourge graphs are really interesting. One of the most optimistic takeaways from the seminar just before this was when Gideon mentioned that, hey, calm down, it's changing. Culture's change. You might have these ingrained needs of a researcher now, but the professors now are teaching the rising students about open science practices and about how maybe to do things differently and to explore all the different paths that you can do stuff. Maybe the extreme conversational liquidity will produce some of the best questions and some of the best methods for finding answers to those questions. So it is like, as we're in this space, like building all these tools with the expectation, like, hey, let's change the way everything's done. It's very refreshing to hear someone who's very deep in the culture already just be like, it is slowly changing from the youth up as we teach people about the ways things need to change to make it better in the future.
Yeah, no, it is, and that's a wonderful, it's a really wonderful thing. And generally, there's these conversations are there was a taboo around these topics, a couple of years ago, and slowly these taboos have receded, and communities have started to really evolve. And I think so. There's a positive track there. There's
Definitely
a great future for all of this. yeah, as long as we can provide, the right types of infrastructure that are conducive to these new norms. And I think, people like the guys over at Open Science Framework have been doing also a tremendous job at like, hey, we're going to make these folders where you can actually track your work and upload components and like put all these different things together, and like you can make science in the open, completely into the open. These are like great things. Cultures around pre-registered report and pre-registered analysis plans where journals will accept and peer review these pre-registered report and then accept it regardless of how the outcomes turn out is also a fantastic development. There are conflicting incentives, though. There's a lot of journals are aware that the number of eyeballs, the number of excitement, how big is big, right? Is essentially what's going to be driving the revenue. Is going to be driving how much APCs they can charge authors. Yeah, they are not exactly extremely enthusiastic at the idea of like accepting a paper regardless of the results. But it is changing, right? And it is changing in a way that's very positive. And I expect that in the coming next couple of years there will be a widespread shift towards accepting those forms of publication more readily from a broader base of participants in the system, and that's really for the best.
Looking forward to it. I'm drained. I'm out. I'm out of ideas.
So yeah, nature, human behavior accepts registered reports. So these things they start happening, right? So like there's more and more support for this idea. That's fantastic.
It is. I'm curious if anyone here, like, just so everyone knows, every week when we do these, we can talk forever. You should definitely talk if you have an idea or a thought you want to share. But yeah, I'm wondering if anyone else has any ideas about scientific societies and replication and incentives. The incentives drive me nuts, because how do you even fix that? How do you make it worth more to do something that just doesn't make business sense? Like, it gets less eyeballs, but it's definitely more valuable from a scientific standpoint. I don't know.
Well, you get good editors, right?
And I've been wondering also about the social or personal incentives, where you're like, okay, but it's so much more fun to feel like you've thought up a problem, and you solved something than just be like, oh, I'm just gonna check that this guy did it right. So I'm wondering, like, what are the incentives around that, where it's like, okay, how do I personally set up my own incentives such that I'm like, yes, I know this is important for science, and I know this is important for self, even if it feels like rote or it feels like the work that I don't want to do. So I'm wondering if there's other ways to incorporate like replication into
Yeah,
these
so-
other.
Yeah, totally. So one of the ways I'm a big fan of is like replicate and extend, right? So you essentially you first part of your article is high powered replication, and the second part is an extension of the work. So that's a way, because what you have done when you do that really big replication is you've also collected a very valuable data set that allows you to ask further questions, because you do happen to have in good replications at least dramatically more statistical power. And that's a really good use. You can verify and extend. I've done that in the past when in my own work, and I think it's a way that is both it teaches you a lot. It benefits the scientific record, and it still allows you some margin of creativity to discover your own thing, essentially to peer into the unknown and look for things that haven't been looked for before. So replicate and extend is a good framework, and I wish people would do more of that. And of course, there's lots of caveats that apply, right? In some cases, not really possible, but in many cases, it is. And these are the types of efforts that really are, because you do end up having a really high value data set, right? And you do want to be able to share that data set widely, and you want to be able to ideally find something more than just essentially ruling that the other person that has, had found a true effect. So yeah, replicate and extend it's a good way to.
I'd love to add on to like the intrinsic motivation to this too, because so I come from the humanities, and there's a saying where it's like, to produce one good piece of whatever, you have to produce 1,000 shitty ones. So and that those bad ones can be sort of a replication of a good piece that you respect. And I would love to see that in science. Like, some of the best questions might come from going through the process someone else did and trying to do it again, and finding, just doing it, tweaking one thing, or finding a novel way they approached a problem, or whatever. Like, you just replicating something doesn't mean you're literally doing it over. You're like it's not like an instruction book, even though science, it is kind of like instruction book, but I think you know what I mean. Like, you're doing it from your own perspective, so you're going to walk away, you're going to see it in a different light, and you might end up with really cool questions to guide like novel research in the future. So it would be interesting to know if that's how this is taught to researchers. Are researchers taught to always go for the novel question, or are they taught that there's actually value in exploring something that's already been done and trying to do it again?
Yeah, I think in general, this is also great training for PhD students, right? And that's also why this type of work needs to be, have wider recognition. In general, replicate and extend is a great framework for PhD students. I think if I was a PI myself, that's one of the things I'd encourage, right? It's very valuable because you really get to learn the ropes. You get to essentially learn so many different high valued skill in that process that it really adds a lot to your future capacity as a researcher. Right? It's absolutely great training. At the end of the day, it really depends. There's different disciplines have different incentives. Also, there's not really one size fits all and one set of incentive that's the same for everyone. And it really will depend on the fields. I think there's fields in particular that would benefit tremendously from advancing a little bit more slowly when it comes to novelty, and a little bit more rigorously and incentive compatible when it comes to producing high quality replication. I mean, we typically think of like medicine and these types of fields that start having real consequences for humans, life and death consequences, right? And I think that's where we should be particularly cautious. This beta amyloid hypothesis in Alzheimer's disease, I mean, it's billions of dollars, right? That's just thrown out the window. Could have been avoided if there was essentially a call for replication that was issued at the point where that truly groundbreaking study, which ended up being unrigorous, was published.
I wonder, and this is something that I'm visualizing as something DeSci nodes can do like by default, but like, if there's to determine whether or not something's impactful and should be replicated, if like once there's 100 citations or some metric on a piece of writing, then there's an automatic call for replication. It's like, oh, it looks like this is going to be impactful. This is a big claim. Let's make sure it's replicated before we continue to build on top of it. Let's make sure the foundation is secure.
So I would argue that citations is already too late, right? Like most,
Sure.
at the end of the day, it's a question of having high participation from some editorial board of some sort, of people that have deep knowledge of the field, and they look at a piece of work and they say, well, okay, big if true, this could change a lot in our field. This is a beautiful candidate for replication incentive. So I think it really depends. The end of the day question is like, can we create sufficient incentives for a high degree of participation within expert groups that are already extremely busy individuals, right? So that's really I think the hardest problem to solve, right? Is tapping into scholarly communities that have deep knowledge and deep understanding of their fields, and that are able to participate in a system and essentially not really upvote, but point out these types of work. And there's really interesting mechanisms surrounding this, right? There's quadratic voting, quadratic curation is a really interesting one. there's some tremendously interesting experiments you can do, and that are in theory quite optimal, in terms of capturing, the intensity of preference, in terms of preventing collusion, in terms of this and that and all of these things, and you can come up with all sorts of really clever mechanism designs around it. But at the end of the day, it's really a matter of like whether these people are motivated to do it in the first place, and whether you can have high participation. So that's really the critical thing we have to cater for, is that it's not sufficient to have a grand plan of some mechanism design to identify what's big if true, but it's really about how do we create sufficient value for these scientific communities that they have an intrinsic incentive or extrinsic incentive or a combination of both to essentially participate at a high frequency in those systems and expand the right level of effort that is required to produce accurate judgment.
Absolutely fair. Very interesting. We are at 1 p.m. Everybody break for lunch.
Great. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.